You are about to listen to the full interview with Brian Entin. Sections of it were originally included in our 2-part UAP episode. If you haven't listened to the full episode, we recommend you go listen. It'll provide context for this interview. Brian Entin, a senior correspondent at NewsNation, is renowned for his in-depth coverage of significant murder cases. His reporting is characterized by on-the-ground presence and immersive storytelling, and has contributed to the Missing series, aiding in resolving numerous cases. He reported on the shocking revelations brought by David Grusch, claiming the US government is hiding crashed spacecraft. He told us more about how that story came to NewsNation and the actions that followed.
Hey, my name is Brian Entin. I'm the senior national correspondent for NewsNation. So NewsNation, along with the debrief, broke the story initially with David Grusch. Ross Coulthart, who is a journalist, really, a really storied career, worked with NewsNation and actually interviewed David Grusch and, had connections with him and set up that interview and did that interview with him and then did that story on NewsNation. So I give him most of the credit in terms of, having that worldwide exclusive. And I sort of came in from there, and we've done a series of follow-up stories since then. I've anchored a lot of shows on the topic for NewsNation ever since that exclusive. I anchored our coverage of the hearings on Wednesday, and have just sort of guided the coverage along. But again, huge credit to Ross, because he's actually the one who really broke the story.
Prior to Grusch's story, did NewsNation have a history of reporting on UAP stories from ex-armed force members?
No, not really. I mean, I think we had done a couple here and there, kind of just like when things would come up that were really big, but not regularly like we have now. And I don't have a really deep history in covering UAPs either. Actually, I don't think I ever, that I can remember, even did a UFO or a UAP story before 2 months ago. So the topic is pretty new to me, but I think that's kind of why we've stood out in a way, because we've kind of come at the story like we would any other story, just like with the same journalistic principles, and not as sort of like UFO fanatics or believers or skeptics or anything like that, which I think is maybe why people have appreciated it, just because we've covered it like any other story. I mean, we've asked hard questions. We don't automatically believe everyone, but we've covered it seriously and fairly and brought a lot of attention to it.
What do you think it is about Grusch's story, from your perspective, that has attracted the attention of NewsNation to cover it so in depth compared to maybe some other UAP stories that have come out in the past?
Yeah, and like I said, I mean, I'd have to go back and look. I think we've covered when big things have happened, just not as intensely as we have ever since we got Grusch. I think it was just, we vetted him really intensely in the beginning. We were really, really careful. The interview wasn't live with him. Ross did the interview. We had vetted him a lot before Ross did the interview. And then we sat on the interview for a little bit, just like triple checking that he was who he said he was. We have a really big Washington, D.C. bureau with a lot of journalists there who have worked in D.C. for a long time with a lot of good connections. So we used them to really try to just, even behind the scenes, just off the record, make sure that David Grusch was who he said he was, that everything about him checked out. Because obviously what he was saying was it was such a big deal. It was so hard to stomach. It was so honestly like crazy at first when you heard it, that we obviously didn't want to go with it until we knew for sure that this guy is who he said he was. So once we found out that like everything about him checked out and there was no real reason not to believe him. And again, we just went at it like any other story. Like when you get a big scoop or a big interview, you have to do those things. And you also just have to sort of ask yourself, like, why would the person be lying? Can we really trust this person? Are they credible? So we took a lot of time going through that process and then went with it.
So maybe let's take a step back and actually just do an overview of who is David Grusch and what were his credentials.
Yeah, so David Grusch is a Air Force veteran. He had like top level security clearance from the U.S. government. He was on the UAP task force as part of AARO. I'd have to pull out his he's got like a really extensive resume that I don't have in front of me right now. But essentially he had the highest level of, clearance for classified information, like which in itself is a massive amount of vetting. And he was a high level, national security, official within the government, essentially.
And what exactly are the claims that David Grusch has made? What are some of the more eye-catching claims that he reported to NewsNation?
Yeah, so there's a lot. The main thing is that he says that the U.S. government has a crash retrieval program. So essentially that there have been crashed craft. We don't know where they came from, according to him. We don't really have a description of them. He says he hasn't seen them, but also there's a lot that he's not saying because he's nervous about his security clearance, and he doesn't want to violate the law. So I'm not really sure that he hasn't seen them, but he won't go down that road. Even in the congressional hearings on Wednesday, they asked him, have you seen these craft? And he said, I can talk about that in a confidential setting. So I'm not really sure what he's seen, but he claims that there is evidence of a crash retrieval program, that he has talked to a lot of firsthand witnesses within this community that he was a part of serving in the military, and that the government has this secret program that is funded without congressional authority. And that's one of the big reasons he came forward, is just that he finds that to be very, very disturbing, and just felt like it was his obligation to alert the American people of this stealth program that exists.
Can you think of any personal benefit for David Grusch to report on the story and come out about it for him? Is there any reason for him to lie about this at this point in time?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I've thought a lot about that. And I can't really think of one. And again, that's kind of one of those questions that I ask myself, with any really big story where you're kind of relying on someone's word. I don't know why he would throw away his whole career. And then I also don't know why the government would have granted someone the highest level of, access to this classified information if they were crazy or had some kind of mental problem or something. I mean, the only thing I could think of is if he had some kind of psychotic break or something, but we don't have any indication that that's the case. And when we first went with the story, we did everything we could to vet him, felt really comfortable about it, but still wondered after we did the story, would there be some kind of pushback from the Pentagon about his record? And that's never happened. I mean, not even behind the scenes, we've never gotten a nudge of, hey, FYI, this guy is shady, or you don't know this about this guy. And now the fact that he, was sort of the star of these congressional hearings, I think also speaks to the fact that he is credible.
Has NewsNation received any information from the Pentagon about his claims, or has it just been kind of silence up until this point?
Yeah, we've gotten a statement essentially saying that, and I don't have the exact statement in front of me. It was worded very carefully, essentially saying, to their knowledge, this program doesn't exist, and not calling him a liar, but saying that what he has said is wrong. But again, in the statement, they said something like, to their knowledge. And I mean, if you ask David Grusch, the people at the Pentagon, most of them wouldn't even know that this existed anyway. So I don't think that really surprised him that they put out a statement like that.
Has he said who he thinks is in charge of this program? If it's so restrictive and secretive, who is the one who's funding it or pulling the strings or making the decisions?
Yeah, that's a good question. He hasn't said. That was another, they really tried to drill in on that during the hearings. And he again said that was only something that he would answer in a classified setting. We know there's already plans to try to meet with him in a classified setting. And he has also talked to 2 different intel committees in a classified setting. So there's a lot that he's said that we don't know about. Also, he filed his official whistleblower complaint, which is confidential. And he also said at the hearing, which was new, he hadn't said this to us before, that I think this had maybe happened since his interview with us, that some of the firsthand witnesses who he had spoken to that knew about this program have now filed briefs with the government, with the watchdog. So, there's a lot he can't say, but it sounds like a lot is also happening behind the scenes.
Prior to coming to NewsNation with the story, did the Pentagon vet any of the information that he put out there? Did he have to get permission? And what do you think that says about the credibility of the story?
Yeah, so he had to go to the DOD and basically tell them what he was going to tell us in the interview and make sure that none of it violated his oath that he took, because he had these high-level security clearances, partly because I think he values what he stood for, being in the military all those years and the important work that he did, and also partly just because I think he didn't want to get arrested. I mean, he would be breaking. So he provided those documents to us before the interview where they signed off on what he could say, approving what he said. So yeah, the DOD did. I mean, it was interesting though. They were clear in those documents to say that they weren't like vouching for what he said and saying that it was true, but they were signing off on that he wasn't, by saying those basics, he wasn't, going to get in trouble.
Yeah, it's just so strange that they wouldn't. I mean, it's such a wild claim, and obviously, if true, has pretty negative implications, I think, for our government in terms of having trust that they even know what's going on within their own systems. It's just surprising that they would allow a statement to come out like that if there was nothing to it.
Yeah, I don't think they probably expected it to get the attention that it did. And I mean, what you said is true. It is disturbing. And that's kind of the way that I've gone at the story. Like, even if you're a skeptic of UFOs, just the fact that it appears there is some kind of secret program and something that's funded by taxpayer money that even the Congress doesn't know about, I think is a reason that like everyone should want to ask these questions.
Well, like in the congressional hearing, he brings up that the way that it's funded is through misappropriated funds. And the Pentagon, when it gets audited every year, and this is something independently of that, always is missing like $1 billion of their funds. So it is interesting to think that where is that money going? So there is some kind of basis of where those funds, that there are missing funds in the Pentagon's budget.
Yeah, the way that it's been kind of described to me is like different programs they'll allocate more money for than they need, and then they can kind of take a little bit out of many different programs to fund something like this. That way no one will know that it actually exists.
David's been pretty non-specific about what he believes are piloting the crafts. He hasn't necessarily said he thinks that they're aliens from another planet. Why do you think that is? And has he ever come out and said something a little bit more definitive about what he thinks the origin of these craft are?
Yeah, I think he said non-human origin. He said that they found biologics on some of the crashed craft, which would be like some kind of bodies or something like that. I think he's just being careful, because I think when we all think of like aliens and UFOs, you can't help but like think of the movies and what you think that these things should look like and what you think these craft would look like and what you think aliens would look like. And we don't really know that that's the case. Like, are these smaller? Are they like drone-like? Are they just weird pieces of metal that were found that, don't register on the periodic table and are clearly not from Earth? Like, I don't think it's necessary. I don't know, but based on his interviews, I don't think it's necessarily like what we all think in our mind, like it is, if that makes sense.
Have you seen, or any other reporters seen, any documents from Grusch or photos or anything that helps prove what he's saying or claiming?
No, the only documents we've gotten from Grusch are his whistleblower complaint, but not the classified part. So we were able to confirm. And his lawyer is the former inspector general for the intelligence community, and is now like in private practice, which was also something that really validated his credibility. The fact that that's like a really big job that he used to have, the lawyer. So we were able to get the documents from the lawyer, which again just beefed up the fact that this guy was legit. So the documents we got were all of those, plus like all of his credentials, his, all of his paperwork from being in the military and that kind of thing.
Since reporting on the story, it sounds like you've seen documents that help support his credibility as a witness, but has anything come out since reporting that maybe hurts his credibility as a witness in this case?
I haven't heard of anything like that. That's what's so interesting. There hasn't been anyone that I've seen that's come forward and said that, I had this dealing with Grusch and he's a nut job, or he did this. I haven't heard one negative story that I've come across. I mean, they may exist, but I haven't seen any. Maybe
if you can give us a little bit of information on what is a whistleblower complaint and why is it that he filed one specifically for this?
So he filed the whistleblower complaint, and this is where it gets really, really complicated, but there's a process you can go through through Arrow, which is the government organization that's supposed to be tracking the UFOs. Grusch didn't feel comfortable going through them because he didn't feel that they would take it seriously, among other reasons. So he went the whistleblower route. And essentially, if you're a whistleblower, the government has laws set up where once you become an official whistleblower, you're protected to a certain extent. You have certain protections. It's like an official process that you can go through where you will be really taken seriously. I mean, and that's the other interesting thing. When they responded to his complaint, they also called it credible in one of the official documents. So it's sort of a way to express a grievance within these high levels of the government and in the intel community in a protected, as protected as you can be. Granted, we know that Grusch has received like death threats, and the reporting that I've done since he came out, we've heard a lot of other stories too from people who have been in the government and had sightings or whatever, and also felt like threatened just because of what they said.
Yeah, I think at the hearing, he definitely touched on that of kind of alluding to that there may have been harm or potential harm that came to people who've talked about this in the past. When you were first reporting on the story to him, did he talk to NewsNation about that a little bit? And did he give any more detail or color around what he means by that?
Yeah, he did talk about it, how that's why he says others are so fearful of coming forward, is just because of, he also says that people have been punished, to the extent of even death, that he's heard about and knows of, which again, even if you're a skeptic of UFOs and you don't think at the end of the day that this is really like secretly crashed UFOs they're dealing with, like if any of that is true, I think it's enough to just alarm anyone that like the government would be intimidating people that way, and then also even like possibly executing them if some of this stuff is true.
And so you said he's actually had death threats against him since coming out with the story.
Yeah. And he's very careful now about, not disclosing where he lives. And when I communicate with him now, it's, through encrypted apps. And he's trying to be really careful about protecting himself and his family.
Do you think there's any ethical considerations for a news organization when running a story like this that Grusch is coming forward, where there maybe is, not a ton of hard evidence other than his word, when there's maybe implications for either his safety or even just the credibility of the government itself?
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's why we didn't just run with it and took our time. And that's the thing about, it's a tricky business. Like, you have to no story is the same. Every story has to be kind of handled differently. There are some stories that you'd come across, you'd say, I would never touch this without pictures and video and documents. And then there are some like this where you make the decision just based on someone's credentials that it's, it passes the smell test and it meets the threshold. But yeah, we talked a lot about that. And in terms of his safety, he was he wanted to come out and talk about this. This is something he wanted to do. So, I think I would have felt a little more concerned about that if we were really trying to like pressure him or convince him to do it. But the fact that this is what he wanted to do and had sort of a plan in place to try to remain, living in a place where people didn't know and stuff, his location, I felt pretty comfortable with that.
Yeah, and maybe talk to us a little bit about the process that NewsNation went through between learning about Grusch and his story and him coming with the story to actually reporting, and kind of like what the process looked like in the time, basically, from learning to reporting. Yeah,
so I don't know the exact timeline offhand, but essentially Ross had this connection to Grusch and also knows people who I work with, and that's kind of how he came into the NewsNation fold. And so they started working together on, vetting Grusch, figuring out exactly who he was, how would this interview actually work, and just sort of took our time. Because again, like when we first heard Grusch's claims, you sort of just had to like process them for a little while, especially being a news organization that like doesn't specialize in UFO coverage. You know what I mean? Like it all sounded pretty wild to us, So we just decided to take our time with it. Leslie Kane, I don't know if you know her. She's like really famous and amazing with coverage of this topic. She broke a couple of the stories in the New York Times early on about the secret government program that was studying UFOs that they denied and then admitted, and has really been at the forefront of this coverage. And I respect her work too, because she's another person that comes at it like sort of with traditional journalistic standards and vets everything that she does. So she was also in touch with Grusch and was writing an article, which helped us a lot because we also knew her reputation and we were able to work together. And she had a lot of sources and we had a lot of sources in DC. So we were able to sort of work together vetting him and also able to lean on her because of her expertise on the subject. So that also helped a lot behind the scenes leading up to the story. But it was interesting, she's talked about this, she was working sort of like as a freelancer, like she wasn't working for a specific publication when she was gathering all this information, and a lot of the like mainstream newspapers turned her down or sort of dragged it out, and that's why she ended up going with the debrief. But it just kind of shows like there were a lot of people that really didn't want to like touch this in the beginning.
Well, yeah, actually, that's an interesting follow-up because she was part of the team that broke the story that was in the New York Times in 2017 that kind of opened the floodgates for all this and has kind of led to the spiral that I think feels like culminated so far in this hearing. Why would the New York Times touch that original piece and not touch this piece?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I've thought about that a lot, especially in the beginning. I don't know the answer to that. I think I know a few. I think she was also talking to the Washington Post, and I can't remember which one told her. Someone flat out said no, and one of them said like, kept kind of pushing it along, like, well, maybe next week or maybe like. I don't know why. I think it was just, I think like NewsNation is 3 years old, a startup. And I think sometimes like non-mainstream media is a little more aggressive with these sort of stories just because we're like trying to be different, trying to do something cutting edge. And, some of these legacy media institutions, New York Times, Washington Post, NBC, ABC, I mean, they sort of have a formula. And I think it's just easy for them, even if it's something really important and they have all the documentation, to just be like, well, why are we going to touch that? Like, we already make all this money. We already have a great following. Like, what's the benefit? You know what I mean?
Oh, yeah. Especially as those companies become more and more corporate, owned by larger and larger entities. Oh, 100%. Understand that.
Yeah. Or when you have like, smaller companies that are trying to grow and are trying to be more aggressive and are hungry, they might be able to, like us, we were more open, I think, to still doing the intense vetting and what anyone else would have done, but a little more willing to, to do it.
Yeah, I think also for me, the initial New York Times article, like while the government was hiding something from the American people, they didn't know what this was. It was still, everyone's in the dark about it. I feel like this story is almost like a little bit more sinister because the government knows what it is and has evidence of it. So it's almost like it's a little bit more combative to report on it, I think. So for me, I could see why the New York Times might be a little bit wary to run with it, but obviously very glad that you all picked up the story and have carried the torch for it. And then what do you think is the possibility that this story could be being used to distract from other explanations for UAP phenomena? Is there any possibility that this is some sort of disinformation?
Yeah, I hadn't thought a ton about it until after we ran the story, and just like a lot of people on Twitter have that's been like a lot of the comments, like, oh, this might be a distraction for something else. Which, I mean, anything is possible, I guess, I mean, I've talked to David Grusch. Like, I don't get the feeling like he's some kind of plant or, I mean, I think that would be really wild. I mean, like I said, anything's possible, but I've thought about it especially since that's been what so many people have commented on the stories, like when I read the comments. So it's definitely like, I've been like, maybe, but I mean, that would be just a wild conspiracy. And you can go down some crazy rabbit holes with this stuff, I mean, if you want to just lay in bed at night and really think, like you can run wild with all sorts of things.
I mean, on one hand, it's happened before. Like you look at the Roswell incident where the government came out and said it's UFOs, and then it came out that it was covering up weather spy balloons that they were testing out. But this seems like such an extreme step of that, to basically have this guy who's, in my opinion, it seems a very extreme way, basically putting this guy's life at risk for this cover. I don't know. It seems very different to me.
Yeah. And there are questions I've had, the parts that I'm skeptical of, just like if other countries are involved, the fact that multiple countries would be able to keep this a secret, in today's world, that is hard to believe. But I guess, if it's that high level and they're spending that much money to do it, anything's possible. The interesting thing too was the other witnesses, Ryan Graves and David Fravor, the fact that their accounts were all firsthand. And granted, they weren't talking about the crash retrieval program, but just when you're talking about UFOs in general, these were, again, one of them was a commander. They were both Top Gun pilots. I can't figure out why they would be lying. When all three of them were sitting next to each other at the hearing, I was just looking at the three of them thinking why would all three of them be lying? And David Fravor even said, kind of like me, he wasn't a UFO guy. He didn't watch the documentaries. He didn't, it's not like he had any sort of reason to be, all into this. So.
Well, Fravor's is very interesting because there's video of what he saw. There's the Tic Tac video, which I think which
was released by the government.
Yeah, it is one of the craziest pieces of footage. And having spoken to people on this show previously and people just in my personal life, that's actually a very common description of people who work in the Air Force. A lot of people give very similar descriptions to what is on that video.
Yeah, and I've wondered too, seeing that video, because again, video released by the government, it's not video that someone, maybe the government altered it, but it's not we saw this on YouTube, or and I've just wondered why more people aren't interested in that when it's right there in front of your eyes. But I think it's just a lot for people to process. You've got so much other stuff going on in your life. People are just trying to earn a living, pay their bills, feed their kids. They're worried about the war in Ukraine. They're worried about the presidential election. I think for some people, it's just too much. You know what I mean? It's just easier to just be I can't worry about the UFOs right now.
It was interesting. I think the hearing yesterday, it definitely felt, or the other day, it definitely felt like a lot of the partisan issues I feel like we've been experiencing in this country seem to disappear on this topic, which I think is actually really interesting. Because in some ways, I understand that, it's maybe feels outside the realm of what's important to people in day to day. But there's something about this existential, not threat, but something outside of our understanding that I almost feel like unifies us in a way, which was actually really cool to see yesterday.
Yeah, no, for sure. Yeah, there were definitely Democrats and Republicans. You didn't see them fighting at all, which was I don't think I've ever seen another hearing where they didn't start getting in each other's throat.
You had some pretty polarizing politicians on that, and they were in agreement. They were synced up, which is very interesting. Brian, why do you think this issue has brought them together?
It's a really good question. I think just the curiosity about whether this is true, and it just doesn't feel political. In the beginning, I was wondering, I felt when we first did the story, it was getting more attention from the Republican side. In the beginning, I just remember noticing that, and I was I wonder why. And I don't know if it was because of maybe there was more of a mistrust of the government or something, and it kind of played into that narrative of don't trust the big government. I don't know. And I felt that initially, but then it did sort of, as it gained momentum, I think it just became totally nonpartisan. I had friends who were Republican and Democrat equally interested. And as for why, I don't know. I guess just the curiosity about extraterrestrial life, transcends politics. I don't know,
which is very refreshing, to be honest.
Yeah.
The hearing was a big deal. What do you think the media's role was in helping us get to this point where we can have a hearing on this topic that had such a stigma against it for so many years?
Yeah, I think the media's role was really big, especially I go back to Leslie Kean, the fact that she was able to publish those stories in the New York Times, I think sort of got the ball rolling and it became more mainstream and you weren't like a crazy person to be talking about this stuff. And then I think our NewsNation story really helped, obviously, when we put the story out with Grusch. It was cool to hear like NewsNation mentioned so many times in the hearing, especially since we're kind of a little bit of a scrappy startup, you're like, okay, this is cool,
But I to give you guys some fairness, like even before this, you guys have really made a big name for yourself very quickly. You've done great work.
Yeah. We've been trying. Yeah, thanks. Yeah. And we've got some, we've hired some big names and, we're now like 24 hours a day cable news network. So, I say scrappy. We have come a long way. I mean, I started when we first started 3 years ago and we were like doing 3 hours a day, so, and we're trying to do non-biased news, like kind of old school CNN pre-Trump, like when it wasn't really about Republican or Democrat narratives. So I think people are finally starting to kind of appreciate that, which is also kind of what's interesting about the UFO coverage. Like, even when we had the hearings on, we were the only cable channel to have the hearings on from beginning to end, which we committed to doing before. We were like, unless there's like something really crazy and awful that happens that you just have to break in. But like, we knew that people were expecting us to cover them in full. So we did. But I noticed, because I was sitting at the anchor desk and underneath we have a little monitor with like MSNBC, Fox News, and CNN, and like none of them covered the hearings live, and they all were on Hunter Biden, which was a big story of the day. But I think, people appreciated that we were doing something like different from just like what the mainstream was doing,
Definitely. What do you think are some of the highlights for you out of that hearing? What are some of the things that stuck with you the most once it was done?
A lot of the stuff Grusch said we had already heard, so I wasn't like surprised by. I think I was just more surprised, like seeing it in the U.S. Capitol unfolding is a lot different than like seeing the interview that we did and set up in a warehouse. You know what I mean? It was just like, wow, like this is really happening. I don't think it's still fully set in for me, like the magnitude of it. And just what a big deal it is that these hearings happened in Congress. So I was kind of like processing that. I was also like, these are 3 military guys. Grusch is a very, they're not like the most animated people. Like they were, in the Navy, and Grusch was in the Air Force. And you're not going to get like people up there that are like crying or screaming or kind of the elements that typically make like good TV. You know what I mean? So there were a few times I was like, it was just interesting. Like their voices were so monotone, but what they were saying, if you listen to the words, was so just insane. You know what I mean? So like, I know that sounds weird, but I was thinking about that a lot during it. Like you could almost zone out, because I was sitting there for the full 3 hours, but then I would start listening again and be like, oh my God, like, yeah, this is really mind blowing. And then the other thing that stood out to me was, which I hadn't heard Grusch say again, was when he said that one of the firsthand witnesses who he was in touch with had filed the brief with the Inspector General. Like that was kind of a big deal just for me, because I was like, wow, like, so the Inspector General now like actually has the name of that person and a firsthand account. So that little nugget stood out to me.
So what happens now after the hearing? What do you expect to be the takeaway, next steps to be from that day?
Yeah, that was the other thing I was thinking during the hearing. Like, I just kept getting this feeling like this is just the beginning, because it sounds like they're already planning additional hearings. They want to talk to Grusch in the confidential, like, skiff, which is the little room, where they can go and have these confidential talks. So I think this is just the beginning. I think obviously we'll have to keep the heat on, and not just NewsNation, but like, I think if we want to see this push forward, like all media has to kind of, hold them to the fire a little bit in terms of the lawmakers, and make sure that, because you know how it is, it's like our attention spans are so short now. Another issue will come up and everybody will divert if they think it's going to like get them votes and interest and, money or whatever.
Why is this such an important story to keep after? As you said, there's a election coming up next year. There's going to be a lot of trials, hearings that are coming up. There is going to be a lot of noise in the news and a lot of big things coming up. So why this story to pursue further?
So I think it's our job to sort of stay on it now. And our boss has been reminding us of that. Like, we have like a duty now to push this forward, Yeah, if you really think about it, there really isn't a story bigger than this, I think, for most people, if they really think about it. I mean, the thought of, another life form out there, other life forms in the universe, I mean, that sort of trumps anything else. So I think that's one reason to stay on it. Also, I just think the government accountability aspect of it is really important. Like, again, just the money and the fact that our Constitution isn't set up for the government to have like a secret program that none of the people we elect have anything to do with. I mean, it's just kind of like a creepy movie, So I think that that's another reason to stay on it. And there's just so many like unanswered questions. I mean, how could we not stay on it? I mean, I feel like it's just like a little tease that we got,
Yeah. Maybe we could you talk a little bit about what the UAP task force is? Yeah.
So the UAP, and I'm not like a real, there's probably someone you could have on that really knows the ins and outs of it. But the UAP task force was set up like essentially the US government, like before the Leslie Kean article, just sort of denied that they were even looking into these things, that it was even in their realm of possibility, and then admitted that they had programs looking at it. And then the UAP task force, to my understanding, like was sort of born out of all of that. And then Arrow, which is supposed to sort of be accountability and a way to keep track of what is actually happening in the U.S. government when it comes to UFOs. But the director of Arrow, I don't know if you guys saw the letter that he put out yesterday. I think it was yesterday. Still basically saying that they have no evidence of David Grusch's claims. Dr. Kirkpatrick is his name. And also saying that he I guess took offense to the tone of the hearings, felt like that it was sort of like an assault on his agency and the hard work that they do, sort of that they, aren't actually really looking into things. And because that's kind of been David Grusch's complaint, is that, they're not really digging into this kind of thing. And they're not really part of the conversation of these secret programs.
Interesting. Although I guess with Grusch's claims, I mean, Arrow wouldn't even have access to this information in the first place, right? So
yeah, that's what Grusch says.
Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah.
And Grusch was actually on the one of the task forces associated with Arrow at one point too.
He was on the UAP task force. Yeah.
Yeah, the UAP task force. That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm curious from your understanding, while he was on that task force, how did he even how was he one of the first people to come forward with the story? Like, how did he get this information during his time on that task force? Like, what does he say led him to uncover this where maybe others before haven't?
So he hasn't given us specifics about exactly how, only that it's multiple people that he came across in his work that he was doing who were part of these programs and would talk about it.
Did he ever give you any insight into how long he believes that this recovery program has actually been active for?
Yes, a long time. He gave us a timeline. I mean, since Roswell, and then and I don't have the interview log in front of me, but he talked about in other countries too, being briefed on, on crash craft in other countries, around the time of Roswell and before.
And so this UAP recovery program, does it cross borders according to him? I mean, is it a global initiative, or does each country have its own program?
Each country has their own, he said, and there are several other countries that also have the program. And he claims that there are government contractors also involved in an effort to replicate the technology, and sort of like an arms race among countries. So we are competing with these other countries in an effort to replicate the technology, which is another reason that he says that it's been kept so secret. And another thing that he's very upset about, which is one of the reasons he wanted to come forward, he keeps referring to it as white collar crime. He says that the government is paying, and he hasn't named which contractor, but a military contractor to house some of these craft. And that, there's a lot of money involved with private industry that is not being disclosed to Congress and the American people. Right.
The hearing was a subcommittee of the National Security Council, not council, but it was a National Security Subcommittee. Why is this story, what does it have to do with national security? I think it's pretty may be obvious, but would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think it's obvious too. Like, I mean, when you hear the, Graves and Fravor talk about their experiences, I mean, obviously, if these craft are coming close to our, aircraft and aircraft carriers, and there was stories about them hovering over a nuclear site at one point, and causing some of the equipment to malfunction. I mean, all of that would be a national security issue. And then also the possibility that it could, and Marco Rubio has talked about this, that it could, some of this stuff we're seeing is possible that it's a technology developed by another country, which would obviously be a security concern for us. So I think like the whole thing very much has to do with national security, which is probably another reason that it's been kept so secret. And, some of that you can understand, like why they wouldn't want to talk about, but obviously not to the extreme of the secrecy that Grusch alleges.
One claim that I think it's overlooked a lot in this is that Grusch says that these may not necessarily be extraterrestrials. He is very clear that he doesn't like calling them extraterrestrials. Could you expand on like what his other theory of who they could be are?
Yeah, so I don't think they know, according to him, like where the craft comes from. He's talked about like and this is just like him speculating in some ways, but like other dimensions, like are there other dimensions within our own world that these craft fly around in that we just can't see? Like maybe they're not coming from outer space. I mean, with the Tic Tac video, it looked like whatever it was went into the water at one point. Is it possible this has something to do with the ocean that they're originating from? I think his point is just that like we all think of the little green men in the movies, and I think we just have to like get that out of our head. Like it might not be what we think. I think that's why he keeps reiterating that, and I think they just don't know, according to him.
Has the White House had any response to the story?
So we asked about it at a couple of press briefings. One of my colleagues did with the spokeswoman. I don't think Biden has specifically been asked, but and not really. I mean, I think they referred it back to the Pentagon or just kind of beat around the bush. There hasn't really been a significant response.
You hosted a roundtable with believers, skeptics, lawmakers. What was the kind of takeaway from each group? Where did they kind of differ, and where were they the same?
Yeah, so and we're actually doing another roundtable show on Sunday night, kind of a similar thing. It's interesting, the skeptics that we've had on, they're not calling Grusch a liar. They're more just skeptical of them actually being UFOs. Or they go back to kind of what you guys talked about. Is this some kind of conspiracy where we're trying to be distracted, or is someone and people are lying to Grusch on purpose? So the skeptics haven't been like, this guy's making it all up. It's more of like, is there something else going on beyond what he's claiming, which is kind of interesting. So I don't know if that answers your question. I mean, I think everybody has a curiosity when we have these roundtables, like, which is what's interesting. That's kind of where I think everybody has come together to a certain extent. But yeah, I don't know. Is that what you were asking? Sorry.
Yeah, no, that's a great answer.
Yeah, it's just interesting. When we've had skeptics on, I kind of assumed they were going to be like polar opposites of the believers. Like, but they're not totally not believers. They're just skeptical that it's actually UFOs. You know what I mean? Like they think it might be something else, but that Grusch isn't necessarily lying.
Do the believers have any skeptical tendencies themselves when you have them on?
No, not really.
Or are they just like full on? Yeah.
They're pretty full on. Yeah. And it's interesting, again, not having been part of this community pre-Grusch. It's an interesting community, like UFO Twitter, and there's a lot of really cool people, and it's kind of been wild. Like, there's all sorts of experts out there. And then like some of the experts don't like the other expert. You have to be careful who you have on together because there's like rivalries and infighting and, like I've done a lot of crime coverage. So there's like a true crime community that I'm familiar with. And it's kind of a similar thing in a different way. Like I just didn't know what I was getting myself into with like UFO Twitter,
Brian, I am part of both true crime and paranormal Twitter. And let me tell you, you are right. There's a lot of overlap and there's a lot of just wild dynamics at play,
Yeah. Which when you're just trying to stick to the facts and like cover it like a news story, some of it can just be kind of amusing. Like people go wild with, there's a lot of conspiracies and stuff, which some people might be right. It's just like, I'm not sure we're ready to take it to the level that some other people are,
I think I saw a lot of people feeling very vindicated by this coverage in terms of their beliefs and feeling like this is kind of this justified. I mean, all of their beliefs and for a very long time. So it's a very powerful moment for them.
Yeah. And that felt good, honestly. Like that felt really good to get that kind of reaction that people felt like they weren't really taken seriously for a long time.
A special thanks to Massimo Teodorani for allowing us to use his music as the underscore for this episode. You can listen to more of his music under his artist name, Totem Tag, on Bandcamp. A link is in the description. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a review on your favorite podcasting app. It helps get this content in front of more listeners, which means we can produce more episodes more often. Visit our website at www.strange-phenomenon.com for a full list of sources and more episodes. Strange Phenomenon is hosted by Ray Tarara. It's written and produced by RJ Blake and Ray Tarara. Theme music by Tara Monk.